My name is Laurel McDonald, and I'm the interim director of the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library. And in keeping with the University of Toronto protocol, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississauga of the Credit River. And today it is home to many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and we're very grateful for the opportunity to work on this land. So on behalf of the University of Toronto Libraries, I wish to welcome you all to the George Cadell Memorial Lecture. Unfortunately, I never had the opportunity to meet George Cadell myself, but I understand from all of his friends and colleagues that he was a most remarkable and wonderful man. And we're incredibly grateful that so many of his colleagues and friends are here with us this evening to remember George Cadell. So thank you. Now, as many of you may know, the Cadell Lecture was actually known as the Griffin Lecture, and it was actually the first endowed lecture of the Friends of the Fisher. And it was a lecture that was responsible for bringing many experts here to Toronto to discuss the history of the book. We've been very fortunate because through George Cadell, we've been able to continue this series, and today it's known as the George Cadell Memorial Lecture. And now the lecture is entering its 24th year, and in keeping with tradition of wonderful speakers, we have with us this evening Dr. Blayney, and I'll introduce Dr. Blayney now. So, after a checkered past that included studying physics at the Royal College of Advanced Technology, training as an actor at the Bristol Old Vic Theatre School, and selling luggage in a Piccadilly shop, Peter Blayney discovered that he was obsessively interested in the early modern book trade. He therefore acquired a BA from London and a PhD from Cambridge and taught English at Chicago for a few years while plotting to become an independent scholar instead. His publications include studies of the printing of the first quote of King Lear and of the Shakespeare First Folio. In 1990, he revealed exactly where in St. Paul's Churchyard the principal bookshops were located, and a few years later, he corrected some widespread misconceptions about the publication of early modern playbooks. He moved to Toronto in 2000 and spent 12 years writing a detailed history of how the Stationers' Company came to be granted a printing monopoly in 1557. That was published in 2 volumes in 2013, but the planned sequel had to be put on hold when the story of the Elizabethan prayer book of 1559 proved to be so extraordinary that it demanded a full-scale study of its own. So this evening, tonight, Professor Blayney will be revealing a large part of that story for the first time under the title, How Many Printers Does It Take to Change a Liturgy? Dr. Blayney?
It's story time, so relax. The tale I'll be telling for the next 50 minutes or so is occasionally a little complicated and involves people you don't know and events of a kind you seldom consider. But that's often true when you read a new book or see a new play or movie. There is not going to be an exam, and your short-term memory is quite accustomed to following unfamiliar narratives from step to step without taking notes. So let your long-term memory take a nap while I talk to the short-term one and tell it a story. Some of you already know at least the bare outline of the beginnings of the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. Published in 1549, substantially reformed in 1552, banned by Catholic Mary a year later, but slightly revised in 1559 to suit the less radical views of Queen Elizabeth. Some of you doubtless know more than I do about the doctrinal importance of that story, but my interest in those books is that of a bibliographer, and I still accept the old school definition of bibliography, the study of books as material objects without regard to their contents. I must therefore confess that I often find the printing and the printers of a book more interesting than its contents or its author. But the slippery slope into bibliography often begins with an interest in a literary text, and it has been sardonically observed that most bibliographers are hesitant to deal with liturgies from the period before, during, and after the Reformation, which means, of course, all liturgies ever. That is probably why the prayer books of 1559 have never yet been examined really closely as material objects. I've been studying early modern English printing for nearly 50 years, and identifying the printers of anonymously printed books has long been a specialty of mine. In particular, I've focused on a phenomenon that became quite common by the 1580s, namely shared printing, the collaboration on a single book of two or more printing houses. The 5 earliest English examples date from the 1520s. The 1530s produced only 6, and the last years of Henry VIII only another 8. During the short reign of Edward VI, the English book trade went into overdrive because the Reformation encouraged literacy and the Church required the mass production of Bibles, prayer books, homilies, and other approved works. Those 6.5 years saw the printing of at least 32 shared books and something new. Most, like the earlier ones, were the work of only 2 printers each, but 3 of them included the work of 3 printers. And while the slightly shorter reign of Catholic Mary produced only 3 shared books, each of the 2 largest were also shared by 3 printers. But in 1559, the Elizabethan prayer book set a record not even approached until the reign of James. So how do I know that? Well, to begin with, most printers owned at least a few large ornamental blocks that served as trademarks, customized devices, or large title page borders. Here, for example, are the first 2 editions of the 1549 prayer book. The one on the left was printed by Edward Whitchurch, and the one on the right by Richard Grafton. The borders are quite different, and if we focus on the foot of each, Whitchurch's has his initials in the bottom corners, while Grafton's name is hidden in the barrel out of which a small tree is growing. The second pair of branches is tied in place. This is a graft and a tongue. But not all books have such borders, and much of my detective work relies on smaller ornaments, especially the display initials, of which most printers kept a varied stock. These, however, can be tricky because popular designs could often be copied quite closely. Woodcut examples are never exact copies, and progressive wear and minor damage could make even cast metal examples individually recognizable. Here are a few examples which are quite easy to distinguish from each other with practice, no matter how similar they may look at first sight. There are, of course, difficulties, one being that printers sometimes borrowed initials from each other. If one examines enough books and catalogues enough initials, however, such anomalies can usually be recognised and solved. But now it's time to get to know some printers. All the prayer books printed in Edwardian London have title pages naming either Whitchurch or Grafton. They had never planned to become printers, but as young merchants keen on religious reform, in 1537 they financed the printing of an English translation of the Bible. That success led to a more ambitious project, a revised translation to be printed in Paris on the largest paper ever yet used for an English book. But when the so-called Great Bible was almost finished, the Inquisition arrested the printer and seized all the printed sheets still in Paris, about 2/5 of the book. Months of negotiation failed to recover those sheets, which the French eventually burned. But Grafton and Whitchurch were allowed to buy part of the printer's equipment and to hire some of his workmen. So they set up a printing house in London and became printers by reprinting the missing sheets. When Henry VIII ordered that every parish in the land should acquire a copy, they bought more equipment and spent 2 years producing 6 more editions. Henry then set them to work on liturgies, giving them a monopoly of the Latin service books then in use. Whitchurch, meanwhile, took half the equipment and set up on his own. But they continued to collaborate, and when Grafton became the new King's printer, they were given a joint monopoly to print service books for the Reformed Church of England. In 1549, each printed 5 editions of Thomas Cranmer's first prayer book, perhaps 15,000 copies in all. The first edition was mostly printed by Whitchurch, but 2 of the leaves, a single-folded sheet, were printed by an immigrant named Nicholas Hill. That was probably a last-minute cancel, a replacement for a sheet in which a serious error had been found. But Hill played a larger role in 3 of Whitchurch's next 4 editions, contributing 12, 20 and 15 sheets respectively. Grafton's first 2 editions were all his own work, but his last 3 contained respectively 8, 4 and 12 sheets printed by one Robert Wyer. But the printers had no time to relax. Many reformers felt that the book had not moved far enough from Rome, and Cranmer was persuaded to produce a more radical version. In 1552, Parliament ordered that the 1549 book should be replaced, so Grafton and Whitchurch had to start again. Whitchurch produced 5 editions in folio, 2 smaller ones in quarto, and 1 even smaller in octavo. Grafton, meanwhile, produced 6 folio editions and an octavo. This time, Whitchurch shared only his last 2 editions with a different immigrant named Stephen Meardman. Grafton shared only 1, but with 2 other printers. Nicholas Hill contributed 4 sheets and John Day 20. Before they could print any more, however, Edward died. The accession of Mary Tudor changed everything, and within days a purge of the book trade began. Grafton was fired as royal printer. His printing house and Whitchurch's were the most productive in England and potentially useful, so the new regime acted shrewdly. Each of them remained the tenant of his premises and the owner of his equipment, but a new manager was imposed on each business. Until Mary died, Grafton's house was run by a Catholic informer named Cayley, while Whitchurch was chaperoned by a scrivener named Wayland. But those 2 evidently quarrelled, and in 1556 Whitchurch sold his lease, moved to Camberwell, and put his equipment in storage. For the rest of the reign, Wayland had to have his publications printed by others. By the end of 1553, Mary had repealed all the Edwardian statutes concerning religion and later made it illegal to use or even to possess Cranmer's prayer books. In 1554, the English Church was formally reconciled with Rome, but remained so for only 4 years until Mary died and was succeeded by her half-sister Elizabeth. And at this point, we need to meet 2 more printers. When Mary needed a royal printer to replace Grafton, she hastily appointed a Catholic named John Carwood. Having served his apprenticeship with a man whose trades were bookselling and binding, Carwood had never been a printer, but he was able to take over the business and some of the employees of Stephen Meardman, who had hastily returned to the Low Countries. Elizabeth became queen in November 1558. Early in the new year, she published a slightly revised form of the English Litany that was being used in her private chapel. Like the proclamation that had announced her accession, this litany claims to have been printed by Richard Jugg, printer unto the Queen's Majesty. But like Mary, she had chosen someone who was not actually a printer. Under Edward, Jugg had been an active publisher of books that he had paid others to print for him, but unlike Carwood, he could not simply take over an abandoned printing house because no printers had fled the country when Mary died. Despite what their imprints say, Jugg's first few royal publications were really printed for him by John Day. Incidentally, most of this stuff about who printed what is new. In February, Elizabeth rather surprisingly appointed Mary's former printer to be Jugg's partner. And for the next decade, almost all royal publications announced themselves as printed by Richard Jugg and John Carwood, printers to the Queen's Majesty. But that official title was the only thing they held in partnership. They never jointly owned a printing house, and not until May did Jugg himself really print a proclamation. Their official imprints locate them in Paul's churchyard, but while both men had retail shops there, only Carwood is known to have done his actual printing in the precinct. The location of Jug's first printing house is unknown. Although Mary was gone, the acts of her parliaments remained the law of the land, and only Parliament could change that. The new Queen and her council soon decided on what would essentially be a return to the Edwardian Reformation, using the 1552 prayer book, but with a few small, though very significant, changes. The complex story of Elizabeth's first Parliament would be out of place here, but the acts that received her royal assent on the 8th of May 1559 included the Act of the Queen's Supremacy, which acknowledged her as the Supreme Governor of the Church of England, and the Act of Uniformity that authorised the printing of the revised prayer book. Printing could hardly have begun before the end of April, but the Privy Council must have already decided who would print it. Of the two royal printers, Jug was not yet an actual printer, while Carwood had never been very productive by Edwardian standards and was busy printing proclamations and the acts of the recent Parliament. The seemingly obvious candidates were the two zealous Protestants who had already proved able to equip the nation's churches with prayer books in a matter of months, twice. Grafton had evicted his Catholic chaperone, but had not yet resumed printing. Whitchurch still owned his equipment, but no longer had a printing house. There was, however, a minor legal problem, because in 1557, Mary had granted the Stationers' Company a monopoly that restricted printing either to freemen of that company or to those specifically granted a royal patent. Grafton belonged to the Grocers' Company and Whitchurch to the haberdashers, so neither now had the legal right to print. But if the Privy Council chose to hire either of them to print a book for the Queen, the stationers would have been unwise to object. The Council evidently commissioned two simultaneous editions. Grafton would reprint his last Edwardian folio edition with revisions, while a team that included Whitchurch would likewise reprint his last folio edition. As many of you know, a folio is a book made up of sheets of paper, each folded once to make two leaves. A book in folio consists of a series of gatherings, or quires with a Q, in which two or more sheets of paper are folded together. Shown here is a folio in sixes. Each quire has 6 leaves made by folding 3 sheets together. Many of the following slides will illustrate one or other edition in the form of a diagram. Think of it rather as a map on which I can show where in the book various things happened. Each gathering will be represented as shown on the right, like this, depending on how many leaves it contains. It's impossible to be certain which of the two editions was finished first. In each case, the final step was printing a title page on the clean sides of several hundred sheets of paper. On the other side, the list of contents had already been printed by someone else to serve for both editions. So each printer probably added his own title page to his share of those sheets on the same day. The Grafton edition is always catalogued as if the first, but only because it was never reprinted. Its rival was the one from which all later editions descended. This is Grafton's title page with the familiar border, and this is a diagram showing its structure. The first quire has 12 leaves and is here segregated from the rest because it was printed last and will be dealt with separately. The rest is a series of 21 3-sheet gatherings, followed by a final one of 4 sheets. Most quires were reprinted page for page from an edition of 1552, and in the few places where the text was revised, only once were any lines pushed over into a second page. But although Grafton did reprint all but one of those quires in 1559, he still had supplies left from 1552. After Mary ordered all Edwardian prayer books to be destroyed, he evidently kept a sizable stock of as yet unbound sheets hidden from the authorities. In 1559, then, he sometimes needed only to print enough of those sheets to make up the desired total. Of the 5 copies whose existence I've been able to verify, 2 include only 1 recycled sheet each, 1 copy includes 8, another 23, and in one extraordinary copy, well over a third of the sheets are leftovers from 1552. The sheets here shown in red were printed by Grafton in 1559. The others are all recycled from 1552, printed partly by Grafton himself, shown in grey, partly by Nicholas Hill, green, and partly by John Day, blue. Because their sheets were printed in 1552, however, Hill and Day will not be included when I count up the printers at the end. The Edwardian leftover in Choir A refers to the king instead of the queen. There is also one place in Choir T where Grafton neglected in 1559 to update a reference to the king and his ministers, an oversight also committed in the rival edition. But before I turn to that edition, I must point out that there was one technically difficult choir that in 1559 Grafton had someone else print. The 12-page calendar, here shown in black immediately after the prelims, was printed by John Kingston. Another grocer, Kingston had been Grafton's apprentice during the reign of Henry VIII. In Mary's reign, he printed in partnership with a stationer named Henry Sutton, who set up on his own in 1557. For unspecified reasons, however, the stationers allowed Kingston to continue printing openly until he died in 1584. Grafton probably asked him to print the calendar because he was unusually good at the tricky job of typesetting tables. While Grafton reprinted his own last edition of 1552, the other team worked from the last Whitchurch edition. This title page claims to have been printed by Richard Jugg and John Carwood, but that is very far from the whole story. In this case, the preliminary gathering is followed by 66 sheets instead of Grafton's 67. Here, however, most of the choirs contain 4 sheets, while 3 have 5 sheets and only 1 has 3. The involvement of Edward Whitchurch is suggested not only by the use of his edition as copy, but by the reappearance after nearly 3 years of his extensive stock of ornamental initials. Some of the types, however, are of designs not previously used by Whitchurch, especially a large German font belonging to the Dutch immigrant Rainer Wolf, and 4 of Wolf's own display initials are mixed among Whitchurch's more numerous ones. Now, Wolf had been appointed typographer and bookseller in Latin, Greek and Hebrew by King Edward, and was kept in that job by both Mary and Elizabeth. He and Whitchurch are not known to have been associated in earlier years, but under Mary they gained a common interest. In June 1557, Wolf and a former servant of Archbishop Cranmer were jointly granted some real estate forfeited to the Crown in 1556 when Cranmer was burned, 422 years ago today. Later evidence shows that their plan was to hold the property until they could legally restore it to Cranmer's widow and children. Margaret Cranmer herself had meanwhile remarried and was now Mrs. Edward Whitchurch. So it is only fitting that Wolfe and Whitchurch collaborated in reprinting Cranmer's book. The evidence suggests that Whitchurch's surviving equipment had been set up in Wolfe's printing house, a few yards northeast of Richard Jugg's bookshop in Paul's. That partnership produced just over a third of the book, but made one big mistake. The Act of Uniformity required the Litany to be revised, and in the first half of it they made all the necessary changes. The state prayer named Elizabeth, and God was newly asked not only to keep her, but to keep and strengthen her in the true worshipping of him in righteousness and holiness of life. But apart from the gender of the pronouns in the next 2 invocations, The only other change was in the list of evils from which the congregation asked to be delivered, where, quote, the tyranny of the Bishop of Rome and all his detestable enormities, unquote, had to be deleted. That phrase can be seen in its 1549 context in the case at the back. Whatever the Queen's own opinion of the Pope, having her subjects publicly defame him once a week seemed hardly politic. But the litany proper is followed by a series of special prayers or suffrages. This is where the more important changes should have been made, beginning with a new prayer for Elizabeth herself. After that, one of the Edwardian prayers should have been omitted and 3 new ones added, all in the innermost sheet of Choir B. It was usual for the work on a folio choir to begin with the innermost sheet and proceed outwards. It is difficult to understand why that inner sheet was inadvertently printed without alteration from the 1552 copy, even though the revised litany had already been printed in January as an octavo booklet. It is even less easy to explain why nobody noticed the omission before the book was finished and on sale. While Whitchurch and Wolfe worked on their allotted section, the next 6 choirs were being produced by 3 other printing houses. John Carwood was busy with proclamations and statutes, so he contributed only a single uncontroversial choir and need not detain us long. The next printer, by far the youngest of those participating, is much more interesting. While perhaps not representing the very highest traditions of the craft of printing, the ingenuity of Owen Rogers is sufficiently unusual to deserve attention. For reasons that will emerge, I think of Rogers flippantly as the one-eyed Welshman, although I doubt that he was optically challenged. He became a Freeman of the Stationers in 1555 and started printing almost immediately. He began with only a single alphabet of small metal display initials, not quite 15 millimetres tall. And because 3 pages in his first book merited something larger, he borrowed some suitable letters from a colleague and subsequently returned them. His own alphabet was probably French because it lacked a W, which in England was one of the 4 most commonly needed initials. Q was probably present, but he printed very little Latin. Initial X is the rarest in English printing, and Zs are most often found rotated clockwise when extra Ns are needed. During his first 3 years, Rogers picked up a few larger initials from others, perhaps while working as a journeyman, because his output is too small to suggest that his own press was in full-time use. But when he began on the prayer book, this was his whole known stock. He would use each of the large ones at least once, but only the 3 smallest of them were treated as if they belonged with the original alphabet, into which I shall now co-opt them. I have already noted that W was one of the 4 most commonly needed initials. The other 3 were A, I, and T. Rogers has 2 small T's available, but any time he needs 2 A's, one of them will have to be an oversized one, and as my flippant nickname indicates, he has only 1 I. The pages printed on the single side of a sheet of paper, only 2 pages in a folio, are called a form. If Rogers began choir H in the usual way, starting with the innermost form and working outwards, his 3rd form needed 2 A's, one of which had to be the big one. But the first real problem that arose was a form that needed an I in each of its pages. Now, a printing type is a letter cast in relief on the end of a stick of metal about 1 inch tall, and some examples are shown here surrounding an ornamental P. While the types in a given font were all the same height, not every font was exactly the same height as all others. Display initials were therefore usually made a little shorter than most types, and the printer had to paste layers of paper or thin card underneath to bring the printing surface up to type height. If it was too low, the edges next to the type would not print properly. So Rogers took his larger T, turned it upside down, and peeled some of the layers off the bottom so that the crossbar wouldn't print and it looked like an eye. But when the T was next needed as a T, it had to be raised to type height again, so this trick was not repeated. When Rogers reached his share of choir I, he found that the inner form of the outermost sheet required 4 initial I's, 2 in each page. So he went to Wolfe's house and borrowed 2 from the Whitchurch stock. He must have given them back almost immediately, because the next time he needed 4 I's at once, he became more inventive. The smaller of these, incidentally, was used by Wolfe and Whitchurch in choir D, but before the book was finished, it had passed to a new owner, and is the only initial used in this book by 3 different printers. But he still needed a 4th I, and was reluctant to shorten his T a second time. There was, however, another trick available. The white lines are grooves cut in the printing surface, and to obscure part of a white line, it was possible to pack the groove with something that would stay in place when the letter was inked, but could later be removed without damage. No such practice is even mentioned in trade manuals, let alone recommended, but I suspect that the substance was wax, perhaps dripped into place from a candle. Alternatively, he could simply have turned it upside down, which under other circumstances was a traditional way of improvising, sometimes done even when not strictly necessary. On only one of these 3 occasions was the small a being used in the other page. To recapitulate, the ingenious Owen Rogers printed choirs H and M and the 2 outer sheets of choir I. The gaps in that sequence were filled by the second youngest of our printers, Thomas Marsh. He too was inventive, only in a different way. He contributed 11 sheets, and in 8 of them, below the black letter text, on a single page seemingly chosen at random, he printed a Roman M, as illustrated here. 3 of those M's have been mistaken by some cataloguers for misprinted leaf signatures, but Marsh had done this once before. In 1557, John Kingston hired him to share a Catholic missal. Marsh had no music type, so his section of that book is interrupted by a Kingston sheet whenever music is required. To make it easier to prove which sheets he had printed and to claim payment, when setting the leaf signature under column 2 on the first page of each of his sheets, under column 1 he added an M for Marsh. In the prayer book he was less consistent in placing it, and for some reason he failed to mark 3 of his 11 sheets, but the evidence of the missal makes it clear what he was doing. Now, in the late 1620s, individual pressmen in the King's printing house started using symbols or numbers in this way to identify their work. A few decades later, pressmen in large printing houses were required to mark their work so that poor workmanship could be penalised. And bibliographers who focus on the 17th and 18th century call these markings press figures. Those who reinvented the idea in the 1620s cannot have known that Marsh had anticipated them, but this prayer book has the added distinction of being one of the first 2 books ever to contain press figures. Like Grafton the grocer and Whitchurch the haberdasher, our next printer had no legal right to be a printer. A gentleman who was not even free of the city, let alone a stationer, in 1556, Richard Payne had married the widow of Thomas Bertlet, formerly King's printer to Henry VIII. After Bertlet died, his printing house was ostensibly run by his nephew, the stationer Thomas Powell, but that was a transparent fiction. The Court of Aldermen of London twice made Payne promise that he would purchase the freedom of the city by a specified date, but he broke both promises, and was eventually forced out of the book trade in 1562 after pirating an edition of Lilly's Grammar. Next, we find another non-stationer. Grafton's former apprentice John Kingston is the only printer who worked on both first editions. His contributions were mainly confined to the preliminaries, and I can find no obvious logic behind the way in which he and Payne shared Choir O. But obvious logic is not always the hallmark of Tudor printing. Last, but by no means least, we have 6.5 sheets printed by someone we have not yet encountered, whose stock of initials and other ornaments is rather mixed. If I survey not only those sheets, but everything else he printed in 1559, I find that he had acquired more than 40 initials from the Whitchurch stock, at least 15 that had once belonged to John Mitchell of Canterbury, and a dozen or so from someone I shall discuss later. At least 5 were borrowed from Kingston, but given back before 1560. At least 7 came from Wolfe, 6 from Payne, and 2 from Carwood. That mixture is the result of being unable to take over an existing printing house, as Carwood had done. Richard Jugg had to assemble his equipment piecemeal. He evidently printed 3 leaves for Choir N, although only 2 survive. In the 1552 edition being used as copy, leaf N3 contained the so-called Black Rubric, a brief defence of kneeling and denial of transubstantiation, written by Cranmer in response to criticism by John Knox. While the Act of Uniformity neither required nor even permitted that rubric to be suppressed, someone in the regime had evidently instructed Grafton to omit it, but had failed to tell either of the Queen's printers. So after printing the sheet that formed leaves 3 and 6 of Choir N, Jugg had to reprint leaf N3 and have it pasted to the stub left when the offending leaf was cut away. All that now remained to be printed was the preliminary choir, and here I'm afraid things get a little more complicated, their fault, not mine. So I'll take it step by step. The 2 innermost sheets are clearly the work of Wolfe. Whitchurch might still have been involved in some way, but I have taken Jugg's acquisition of most of his ornament stock as marking the end of any realistic claim that Whitchurch had still to be a printer. The next 3 sheets were printed on both sides by Kingston, and the last inner form contained only Kingston's setting of the contents, while the other page was blank. That left only one form to be printed, namely the outer form containing the title page and a 30-year almanac, which was printed by Jugg. The most remarkable thing about that outer sheet is that Kingston had printed enough copies of the contents list to serve 2 editions, of which the other was Grafton's. Each printer had evidently printed his own version of the outer sheet when the authorities suddenly insisted that the contents list had to be cancelled and reprinted. The fact that the sheet containing leaves 4 and 9 is also identical in both editions, printed by John Kingston, suggests that it too is probably a cancel, probably reprinted to correct some significant shared error in the table of proper lessons. That, however, is a guess. What is certain is that after Kingston had printed the revised contents, Jugg and Grafton both had to reprint their title pages and almanacs almost certainly on the same day. But there is another complication, because the Grafton almanac also appears to be Kingston's work, even though the title page in the same form is Grafton's. I've shown it here as if actually printed by Kingston before the sheet was given to Grafton, but Kingston may rather have set it with his own type and then lent the assembled page to Grafton to be imposed and printed with the title page. As with the calendar, Grafton may simply have thought that Kingston was better at setting tables. The revision of the contents list is another previously unnoticed part of the story of this book. In 1552, Edward's Act of Uniformity twice mentioned that the prayer book was to be accompanied by an ordinal, a short manual containing the forms of service for ordaining deacons, priests, bishops, and archbishops. So every folio edition of 1552 had an ordinal appended, and in 1559 both teams duly printed one, because the new Act of Parliament said nothing about omitting it. 6 copies survived of the ordinal printed by the Jug team, but none is bound with their first prayer book. It consists of 9 sheets, 2 printed by Jug, 3 each by Payne and Kingston, and 1 by a man we have not yet met called William Copeland. Only 1 copy of Grafton's ordinal survives, bound with the copy of his prayer book in which nearly half the sheets are recycled. It shows that he had made 2 bad mistakes. One was reprinting his 1552 colophon with only the date changed. But it was 6 years since he had had the right to call himself Typographus Regius before being fired, and he no longer had privilegio ad imprimendum solum. The other mistake was reprinting the schedule of prices set by the Privy Council in 1552, which had specified maximum prices for copies both with and without the ordinal. But this copy is the one in which the Privy Council itself both recorded and signed their decision on the new price, which applied only to the prayer book without an ordinal. Whether or not those mistakes of Grafton's were considered serious enough to merit suppression of his edition, it is a fact that no other copy survives, while there are 6 extant copies of the Jug version. And the principal difference between Kingston's revised contents list and its 1552 original is that the ordinal has been removed from the list. Richard Grafton's prayer book was the last book he ever printed, and before long his printing materials were dispersed. What I have called the first Jug and Carwood edition is the first book with their joint imprint that actually contains sheets printed by each of them, but only 7.5 by Jug and 4 by Carwood, so they printed only 16% of it. Neither of the first 2 editions was quite perfectly revised, although Grafton's few oversights were trivial beside Whitchurch and Wolfe's blunder with the Litany. So the Jug team immediately started work on a corrected reprint, of which the recently acquired Fisher copy, in the case at the back, is one of only 2 that are complete and the only copy outside England. Now that he had finally become a printer, Jug needed less help, so Rayner Wolfe and Thomas Marsh dropped out. This time, Jug printed 33 sheets and Carwood 18, while Rogers and Kingston supplied 8 each, and Richard Payne 5. Note that in the absence of Wolfe, Kingston once again was chosen to reprint the Calendar Choir. Between those 2 editions, Owen Rogers prudently decided to do something about his shortage of crucial initials. London printers had access to at least a few expert manufacturers of both wooden and metal printing ornaments. But skilled workmanship was probably not cheap, so Rogers settled for something rather less, or perhaps found a suitable piece of wood and did it himself. A W was certainly a useful addition, and you would think that whoever cut that could have managed a comparable I. But no, Rogers just continued to improvise, packing the arms of his larger T either upright or inverted. It was more difficult to pack the smaller crossbar of his other T, so after one attempt he simply used it upside down without caring. But having only 2 T's with which to augment his single real I, when he reached the form that required 4 I's, he had to think harder. His choices were restricted to letters with straight stems of full height, but most of their stems were too close to one side or the other of the square. The best in that respect were B and E. So once he took his B and another time his E, inverted the letter and packed it, and earned himself a small but special place in printing history. But the packing did not always stay in place, and in some copies it's clearly shifting and being pulled away. In the copy at Lambeth Palace, the E is almost completely exposed. The third edition of the Book of Common Prayer can claim to be the first completely revised edition because, as well as correcting the litany, it updated the confirmation service where both previous editions had mentioned the king instead of the queen. Also, it finally corrected all the Old Testament readings assigned to each day in the calendar, nearly 50 of which had been scrambled in 1552, and of which only half had been corrected in the first two editions of 1559. But not even this edition is flawless. Since 1552, the New Testament reading for morning prayer on Christmas Day had been prescribed by the Table of Proper Lessons as being Luke chapter 2, which is his account of the Nativity. In the 1552 calendar itself, however, this was misprinted as Luke 22, which runs from the Last Supper to Peter's denial, not very Christmassy. And that mistake remained uncorrected for 26 years through 50 editions. Meanwhile, the third edition of 1559 inevitably introduced a few slips of its own, such as changing "O God, make speed to save us" in the morning prayer to "O God, make haste to speed us." Until very recently, I thought that there were 7 copies of the third edition, of which the imperfect copy in the Library of York Minster was the only one I had not yet seen. But when I examined it 2 weeks ago, I found that it is a hitherto unrecognised edition by the same 5 printers, which I shall here call the 4th edition, although I cannot yet prove it to be the later one. The preliminaries are lost, so Jug and Kingston may not have shared them in quite the same way. But what survives is the work of the same 5 printers, and down to Quire I, they each printed the same quires as before, with Jug once again printing the whole of Quire L. But in Quires K and M through P, the sharing differs considerably for no very obvious reason. Before I leave the folio editions and deal very briefly with the smaller formats, it's worth noticing that in Jug's sheets in Quires L and M of the third edition, a cluster of 7 initials formerly owned by Richard Grafton appears, 5 of which Grafton had used in his own edition of the prayer book. The obvious conclusion must be that shortly after finishing that edition, Grafton finally gave up printing and began getting rid of his equipment. Yet another example of a Grafton initial is found in the 4th edition, a very old-fashioned unseal M that Grafton had correctly used as an M, but Jug's compositor apparently failed to recognise it and thought it was a T. Among the Jug initials that had belonged to John Mitchell was a rather splendid A that Jug used several times in 1559, one way up or the other. His ex-Whitchurch initials included what had once been a Q before it was deliberately mutilated to serve as an O. Turning Q's into O's and O's into Q's was in fact not uncommon at this time, but whoever turned Mitchell's favourite F into a very amateurish E went a bit too far. I can draw no serious conclusion from these few curiosities, but I didn't want you to think that Owen Rogers was the only printer who knew how to improvise. Having finished the 4th folio edition, Jug and Carwood produced 2 editions in quarto. In the earliest one, Jug printed the first 28 sheets and Carwood the last 16 and a half. But Carwood did what Jug had done earlier and mistakenly included the black rubric of 1552, which may be why Jug printed the next edition without his assistance. The folio editions of 1552 included the ordinal because they were intended primarily for the clergy, but the smaller formats, designed more for the congregation, were followed instead by a psalter with a few appended prayers. But in July 1559, the Queen's principal secretary, Sir William Cecil, procured a royal patent for his former servant, the publisher William Series. Edward had granted Ceres a patent for books of private prayer, as distinct from common prayer, but this had been cancelled by Mary. To compensate for her losses during her reign, this new grant added a monopoly of, and I quote, "Psalters, both in great volumes and small, in Latin or English, which now be, or at any time hereafter shall be, set forth and permitted by us, our heirs and successors, any other order heretofore granted notwithstanding." What this was apparently intended to cover was only a form of separately published psalter without the added prayers, but prefaced by a short selection from the prayer book, the list of proper lessons and psalms, morning and evening prayer, and the litany. Taken literally, however, the new patent appeared to deny the royal printers the right to include psalms in the prayer book or even in Bibles, and that is how Ceres apparently chose to read it. So the Psalter appended to the 1559 quarto prayer books was printed neither by nor for the Queen's own printers. Claiming to be printed by Ceres, who was not a printer, it was really printed for him, partly by William Copeland, who we have met, and partly by Henry Sutton, who had once been John Kingston's partner. Some kind of compromise was evidently hurriedly arranged, probably by the Stationers' Company's own court, and thereafter Ceres published only separate psalters of the kind probably intended. And beginning with the very last edition of 1559, all subsequent editions of the Book of Common Prayer, including those in folio, contained a psalter printed either by or for the royal printers. That last edition was an octavo, which survives in only one copy and is the first and only 1559 edition to be printed from start to finish by a single printer. Both the title page and the colophon at the end of the Psalms agree that it was printed by Richard Jugg and John Carwood, printers to the Queen's Majesty. So by now it should come as no big surprise to learn that it wasn't. It was printed for them, and in their names because they held the royal patent, but it is the unaided work of John Kingston. To conclude then with a very brief summary, let me take the 7 editions of 1559 in order. One of the 2 first was printed mostly by Richard Grafton, but 4 sheets and 2 single pages were printed by Kingston. The presence in some copies of sheets printed by others in 1552 does not really count. The other first edition was the work of 8 printers, or 9 if we include the ordinal. 5 printers shared the 3rd and 4th folios, 4 the first of the quartos, and 3 the second, and only the octavo was the work of a single printing house. Nothing even remotely comparable had ever happened before in the English book trade, and it would be more than 40 years before the nearest parallel I know of. In 1559, there were 18 printing houses in London, and the answer to the question posed by my title is 11 of them. Thank you.